There you go.
Thanks very much.
You're very welcome, thank you. Hi, my name is Michael Jackosn, but they call me the beer hunter. They call me the beer hunter because I spend my life going to breweries, bars and restaurants looking for great beers. And these days, when I go into a restaurant, I'm very often delighted to be given not a wine list, but a beer list. I'm very pleased about that because if I'm trying to fire up my appetite, I like to have a very dry tasting beer. If I was thinking of having perhaps half a dozen oysters, I might like to have a dry stout. If I'm going to have white fish, I'd very much like to have a pilsner. And if it's going to be red meat, it's probably going to be an English style ale. I even like to have beer with my desserts. If I'm having chocolate, I just love to have a really rich stout. There's a different beer for every food, there's a different beer for every moment, there's a different beer for every time of year. In the heat of the summer, there's nothing quite as quenching as a wheat beer. In the cold of the winter, on a winter's night with a book before the fire or a late night movie, there's nothing quite like a really rich, strong barley wine. Some of them are imports from Europe, but a great many of them are being made in the United States. They're being made in tiny breweries at pubs. They call them brew pubs, or in very, very small breweries that are often known as microbreweries. And these tiny new breweries are springing up all over the country. It's part of a renaissance in the appreciation of beer. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about that, why don't you join me in this program about the new beer renaissance in the United States?
Imagine one day you go into a nice restaurant. The waiter takes you to a table, tells you the specials, and then hands you not a wine list, but a list of beers to choose from with something to fit every occasion and complement any meal. Sounds strange? Well, maybe not, because with the new emergence of microbreweries, suddenly the beer lover too has a choice. Thank you. And like the wine connoisseur, the more you know about the quality and characteristics of these fine brews, the more you'll appreciate the beer you drink. Hi, I'm Mark Sparks. You know, for most people, beer is a pretty generic term. They use it to describe lagers and ales, porters and stouts, bocks and bitters, just about any of the malt beverages produced by fermentation. But as any beer lover can tell you, not only are there differences between these brews, but something very special to be found in each. So for the next few minutes, we're going to explore the world of the brewery and the rich and flavorful beers they create. We'll show you the wide range of beers available and how the brewer's art makes each one unique. We'll describe the characteristics of the different types of beers and offer some tips to help you pick the one that's just right for you. In short, you'll be ready to answer the question that people have asked throughout history. How do I find a really great beer? Beer is not only the most popular alcoholic beverage, it's also the oldest. In 6000 BC, beer making was already a well-established and carefully controlled activity in Mesopotamia. The ancient Babylonians gave the death penalty to anyone convicted of selling bad beer. In the Egypt of the pharaohs, workers were often paid with jugs of beer. During the Middle Ages, monasteries took over much of the brewing art, creating a high-quality beer for their noble visitors and a much humbler grade for their other guests. In England, after the Reformation, monasteries gave way to the commercial brewer, who often worked under royal license. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, it was in large part because their supply of beer was running low. George Washington kept a small brewery at Mount Vernon, preferring his own stock over the commercial brew of the day. The golden age of American brewing came at the end of the 19th century, when there were over 2,000 breweries in this country. And with both the British and Central European brewing traditions to choose from, American beer drinkers could enjoy almost any style imaginable. But in 1919, passage of the Volstead Act, better known as Prohibition, outlawed all alcoholic beverages, including beer. While some brewers survived by producing soda water and malted milk, most were forced to close their doors forever. Since the end of Prohibition in 1933, the industry has been dominated by a handful of large breweries. The result has been a lack of variety.
Label, black label, darling black label beer.
What?
Sure. Where there's life, there's fun.
Until now, because there's a new kid on the block. In just a few short years, the craft brewers, better known as microbreweries, have brought the art full circle. The microbrewery uses the same traditional methods that have made beer a staple for centuries, but we'll talk more about that later. Right now, I'd like to tell you a bit about how beer fanciers talk to each other. You see, there's a whole language that's grown up to describe the many qualities of a fine brew. Many of these terms will become more familiar as we discuss the beers in this program. To begin with, the term balance is used to describe how all the ingredients blend together. If we call a brew hoppy or malty, that means one or the other is more assertive or dominant in the balance. There's no secret correct balance a brewmaster seeks out. There's only each person's interpretation within the guidelines of the tradition of each style of beer. That being said, the test of the brewmaster's art and skill is in the balancing of the elements.
The main ingredients in a good beer, a classic beer, a traditional beer, are barley, hops, yeast, and water.
Brewing is an art. It is an art form.
It's a very fragile thing, and there's so many places along the process that if you don't focus your attention on it, things can go wrong.
And so it's not just important how much of each particular ingredient you use, but also the temperatures that you cook that ingredient at and how long you hold it at that particular temperature.
If you throw in a lot of hops early in the boil, it'll make a beer a little more bitter. And if you throw a lot of hops in, it'll make it a lot more bitter.
In general, a malty taste is sweeter, a hoppy taste more bitter. Thank you. Full-bodied is considered a term of approval implying rich flavor and strength. The opposite would be a light-bodied beer, the term more commonly associated with the mass-market brews. When trying a beer for the first time, look for good color, a thick natural head of foam, and an aroma with a fresh, clean balance of all the ingredients. And finally, take a moment to consider how the beer finishes. Does it have an unpleasant aftertaste, or does the taste fade too quickly? You'll find that a great beer has a finish that lingers just long enough to enhance the experience. The best way to judge a beer is to know something about the style you're drinking. That way you know what to expect. Because, as we've said, there's something special to be found in each. But to better appreciate what makes them all different, let's take a look at a few things that stay the same. You could say it all starts here. Like so many others around the country, This eastern Washington barley field provides the prime ingredient for the brewmaster. In fact, with just a few exceptions, there are only 4 basic ingredients to every glass of great beer: malted barley, hops, yeast, and water. Once the barley is harvested and classified as malting quality, it's delivered to the sieves and cleaners that remove any foreign objects like rocks or chaff. When the hard grain's been cleaned, it's soaked in water to help with the germination or growth. Within a few days, a tiny root grows out of each grain. When the germination period is complete, the moisture content is gradually reduced and the grain is placed in kilns to be dried. The result of this process is known as the malt. If a dark beer is desired, the malt is roasted to change its color and flavor. Once the malt has been inspected to ensure its quality, it's shipped to the brewery. There, the malt is milled or crushed into grist and placed in mash tuns. In these metal casks or vats, the grist is mixed with hot water to produce mash, a gruel-like liquid which contains both sugar and protein. Next, the mash is diluted and filtered into a clear liquid called wort. The wort is placed in a brew kettle where it is further diluted and then boiled. It is here that the actual brewing process begins, with the addition of hops. Hops is a climbing plant that grows wild in many parts of the world. It has a dry bitterness that provides the other important flavoring element to beer, balancing the natural sweetness of barley. Only the flower or cone of the female hop is used in beer. After it's picked, the hops are processed into pellets and shipped to the brewer. There it's added twice to the brew kettle, early to give the beer a bitterness and to act as a natural preservative, and later to give it aroma. When the hopped wort is taken from the brew kettle, it's allowed to cool until the temperature is low enough to begin fermentation. Fermenting is the stage in the brewing process when yeast is added to the wort, a process known as pitching the wort. By adding the yeast, the sugar is converted to alcohol and carbon dioxide, the gas that gives beer those little bubbles. From here, the beer is pumped into storage tanks where it's allowed to age. Later, it is bottled or placed in barrels for the customer. So, there it is. You start with barley, add water, hops, a little yeast, and you've got beer. Pretty simple, right? Wrong. There are countless variables each step of the way. Where did you get your water? Is it hard or soft, acid or alkaline? And what about the barley? Where did it come from? And what was the weather like on the field this year? What about the hops? Are they American, German, English? Do you want top fermenting yeast or would bottom be better? How long do you want to age it? Should you continue fermenting in the cask? Well, you get the idea.
You could start with any pure water and make any of the styles of beer.
4 main ingredients, the most important one being water.
Malt is the backbone of beer.
And our grains come from the Midwest and the West Coast, and so I think the best bet looking for good product, good raw materials is to look right here in America.
Malted barley is to beer, but grapes are to wine.
The winemakers, they really don't have much choice in making differences during the process, whereas with the brewers, you have enormous possibilities of changing things.
And the hops, of course, are the spice of the beer.
They're a flower, and you can look at it as picking a rose or something. As soon as you pick it, the aroma starts dying off.
You could put hops in just about anything if you wanted to, but in beer, hops is used as a seasoning agent and a preservative.
It's a crop. And sometimes you have a good crop, sometimes you have a crop that isn't as good, and you have to make adjustments in the hops. So every year, we're looking to either try and find the hops that are exactly the same aroma and flavors that we had last year, or if they're slightly different, then that's the brewmaster's job, is to understand the differences in the crops and adjust the beers to compensate so that the beer stays the same product. Otherwise, you'd be having a slightly different product from year to year.
All hops will give you a distinctive flavor. You know, very few hops are the same. They're in groups, and you may not be able to distinguish them in the groups except at high concentrations, but they all do have totally different patterns of aroma.
And the yeast, of course, is a catalyst which turns all of these reasonably dissimilar materials into the final flavor of beer.
I could take my exact same recipe as far as the grain and the hops and take it to some other brewery, and they could try and make that same recipe, and you'd end up with a similar beer, but it would have a different flavor. The yeast is a very important characteristic, and most breweries protect their yeast very carefully. That's a very proprietary thing.
Our particular yeast strain comes from Germany originally, and we maintain that here at the brewery.
It's a very complex process that nobody, I don't care what they say, fully understands or even remotely understands. Very many things can happen.
When you add the hops in the kettle, do you add hops after the kettle? You know, these are all good possibilities and can lead to enormous differences in the final product.
You're starting with carbohydrates, which is starch, which is a whole bunch of sugars stuck together. You're going to be breaking sugars off of that chain, and how long you hold it at each temperature is going to determine how much of each type of sugar you're going to get. So it's all very important. It's real complicated, more complicated than people think.
The brewmaster is equal parts technician who understands the scientific process involved in brewing and fermentation, and great cook who looks upon beer as a work of art. From only 4 basic elements, they create an amazing variety of color, aroma, texture, and taste. And to our everlasting enjoyment and gratitude, they never seem to run out of new recipes to choose from.
Just like there are all different kinds of wine, there are all different flavors of beer as well. In fact, there are probably at least as many different flavors and tastes in beer as there are in wines. There are sweet beers, there are dry beers, bitter beers, burnt beers, very delicate beers that are floral. And each of them certainly will go with different types of food in different ways.
And how do you choose? Well, as we've said, you should know something about the style you're drinking, but it's just as important to be familiar with the other styles available. What better way for you to decide which one's right for you?
And I'm not convinced that people are inherently born with bad palates, but rather the reverse. I think people have a good palate, and people, even though they quite often would tell you, I can't tell the difference in a red wine and a white wine, I don't really think that's the case. I think that people do have good taste, and they can identify the difference in a really wonderful piece of salmon, for example, and one that's not quite so great. In the same way they can identify the difference in a really great beer and one that's not quite so great.
So, now that we've shown you what most beers have in common, let's take a look at what makes them different. Lager beer has been with us since at least the 15th century, when it was carefully stored in the cold mountain caves of Bavaria. Indeed, its cultural roots can be found in the breweries of Germany and Central Europe, where it caused something of a brewing revolution by the 1840s. The name comes from the German word lagern, meaning to store, because lager beer is aged before it's placed on the market. Lager is also what most Americans think of when you mention beer. All lagers are fermented with a bottom yeast, which means that it settles to the bottom of the fermenting tank. With a light color and mildly hopped, most industrial brands fall into this category.
under the lager banner can fly something as to one side as the beers from the major breweries, but then there are other very traditional varieties of lager that are indigenous to Austria, Czechoslovakia. Certainly Germany has, just in its own small borders, maybe as many as 14 different very distinct styles of lagers. Some of these lagers are produced with smoked malt, have a wonderful peaty character to them. But these are all lager fermentations because it's derived from a cold fermentation and an extended period of storage.
With less of the dry bitterness of hops, lagers have a nice light flavor and a refreshing quality. They also come in a number of different styles. Here are a few of the better known. Remember that brewers' revolution we mentioned earlier? Well, it was really the Pilsner beers that stood on the front line. By the beginning of the 19th century, brewmasters for the first time had some of the tools they needed to reliably control the quality of their product. But since lagers needed a cold place for aging, it wasn't until the introduction of refrigeration that the Industrial Revolution changed brewing forever. In 1842, a large brewery opened in Pilsen in Bohemia. Contrary to contemporary tastes, it was devoted entirely to a bottom fermenting beer. The result, a golden-colored, light, dry lager, was an immediate hit. In fact, it's remained so popular that 150 years later, the town of Pilsen still lends its name to the beer we enjoy, Pilsner.
The Pilsner's characteristics is the hoppy nose. Before you drink it, you smell it, and it should have a nice hoppy nose in it. And during drinking, you also should feel the hop in it, but it should, when you finished, it should not have a hanging hoppy thing in the throat. So it should be nice from the start until the end with a nice hoppy character.
With a medium hop flavor and a light to medium body, the Pilsner style has been imitated in every part of the world. The better examples have a clean herbal aroma and a dry finish. Earlier, in describing the brewing process, we said that some of the malt was set aside and roasted to be used for dark beer. Well, there's another German city that's given its name to that modern beer style. Bavaria has been a center for brewing since the 8th century, when it grew the hops that were used for beer all over Europe. It's been famous for its dark beer since the early 1800s. The capital of Bavaria is Munich. And not by coincidence, when you order a dark brown beer brewed in this tradition, you ask for a Münchner Dunkel.
The dark lager has got its character in the maltiness you get out of the little bit more roasted malt. You take for brewing not too roasty malts that otherwise you get the so-called Rauchbier we also have in Germany, the smoked beer, because they heat it a little bit more. But the taste for dark lager is based on the character of the maltiness and round maltiness. There's also not so much hops in it, just a little bit to give them a nice touch, a nice nose when you smell it. That's basically the dark lager beer.
A Münchner-style brew covers a wide range of tastes and texture. The most common has a medium body with a lightly toasted maltiness. You'll find the less conventional brands can vary from hoppy or tart to malty, which makes them sweeter. There are many stories about how Bock beer got its name. One popular belief is that it came from Ziegenbock, the German word for billy goat. As a matter of fact, the horned goat symbol is used to decorate many brands of the Bock brew. Another version is that the name was derived from Einbeck, the Saxon city where it was first brewed in the Middle Ages. For the early beer lover, Einbeck became Beck, which was eventually slurred to Bock. At one time, Einbeck, or Bock beer, was given as a gift on special occasions, the way champagne is today. There's even a record of the citizens of Wittenberg sending a barrel of Einbeck to Martin Luther as a wedding present.
Bock beers take many different forms. To the uninitiated, people tend to think that they're very dark and very syrupy and very strong. And some of them are, but not all of them are.
If I were to describe a Bock, I would describe it more than anything kind of a profusion of malt and alcohol. I mean, those would be the two main flavor components of a Bock.
It is a bit stronger than our regular beers, but the alcohol is not the focus here. The flavor is the focus, and the focus of a good Bock beer should be a very heavy accent on the malt.
Most Bocks are light, though some brewers make a darker version. They're full-bodied, have a moderate to strong hop taste, and a higher alcohol content. And speaking of alcohol content, there's an even stronger version of the Bock brew, the Doppelbock, sort of the heavyweight of the lager world, loosely translated, twice the kick of a billy goat. Originally brewed by Bavarian monks, these are the strongest beers you're likely to find. They're dark, full-bodied, and often quite sweet. Doppelbocks also have a heaviness that frankly makes them an acquired taste for most people. One curious tradition left over from the original Doppelbock is that they all have names ending in ator, optimator, celebrator, animator. With an alcohol content between 2 and 3 times that of most American beers, trying this brew may put you more in the mind of the Terminator.
Whereas this festival is dedicated to the informing and educating of the discriminating connoisseur of food and beer on the traditions of Oktoberfest. Now, therefore, I, Richard Mitchison, Mayor of the City of Paulsbo, do hereby proclaim official Thomas Kemper Oktoberfest weekend. Signed, Richard Mitchison, Mayor. Thank you, Jack.
Seasonal and festival beers are just what the names imply, a specialty, brewed for a particular festival or at the mercy of certain weather conditions. For example, the lagers stored and aged in those icy caves in the Bavarian Alps could only be brewed at one time of the year, which means that every year there was a special time to tap the kegs too. And in those days you could be pretty sure a festival would follow. In fact, Oktoberfest is traditionally the time when the last of the beer brewed the previous winter is brought out to be enjoyed.
First of all, it's a nice copper-colored beer. It utilizes a lot of malted barley grains that are roasted to varying degrees. These grains, if you were to chew them up, have a wonderful toffee-like, almost a granola crunchy character to them. And it produces a product that is at once malty, but has a nice hop finish to it. It's relatively full-bodied without being overwhelming. It's a very satisfying beer.
You'll find that most brewers have at least one seasonal or festival beer to try. They're brewed at different times of the year, but most are available for Oktoberfest or Christmas. They're as different as the people who make them, so exploring this particular style will introduce you to some pleasant surprises. So far, we've talked about the different types of lagers, generally defined as a beer fermented with a bottom yeast, or one that works without air at the bottom of the fermenting tank. While, as we've said, balance of ingredients is the chief factor in determining the different types of beer, it is the fermenting process that distinguishes the lager from another popular brew, ale. Ale is the oldest type of brew. It's quite possible that it was discovered accidentally by some thirsty and very fortunate prehistoric beer lover. You see, unlike lagers, ale ferments with a top yeast, a process that can occur naturally and doesn't require excessive refrigeration. So while widespread practicality of the lager depended on the Industrial Revolution, European brewers have produced ale for centuries under almost any conditions without fear of it spoiling.
Most of the micros, not all, but most of them are making ales, whereas the American-style beers are lagers. And that right there is the first split in the whole world of beers, is between ales and lagers. And it's based on the kind of yeast that's used. But you end up with very, very different products. And then from either side of that family tree, if you will, you have all the styles coming down. On the ales, you have the stouts and the nut brown ales and the Belgian ales. They're almost in a category on their own, actually. But and on the other side, you have pilsners and all the continental style lagers that you see.
The various styles, tastes, and colors are steeped in a very old tradition, many with an English or Celtic connection. It's these brews we'll talk about now. The English pub is one of the most enduring images for the beer lover. And while time and social habits may have changed these popular gathering spots, one thing has remained the same. They are one of the last bastions of top fermented brews in the world. Now, the purist will tell you that real ale can only be found in one of these pubs. But if you can't make the trip, don't despair. You can still sample many of the brews served there. Here are a few of the more popular styles. Bitter ale is the everyday draft beer of the English working man. It's typically malty and full-bodied, with a color ranging from amber to a deep mahogany. You'll find it lives up to its name because the strong hopping often makes it extremely bitter. This quality, however, does vary from brewer to brewer, and you may find one that suits your palate.
Many ales can have a bitter finish due to their hop level. And when you say bitter, it's true it's bitter, but it's balanced with malt sweetness. So it's not you're drinking something that is purely bitter. Just like in spare ribs, a sweet sour sauce isn't purely sour. It has the counterbalancing flavors that play against one another on the tongue, and it's very entertaining.
I like to say that I may be small, but I like to brew big beers, and this is one of them. And the India Pale Ale, if you smell it, it smells like a bowl of flowers or fruit. It's a real garden of hops. And if you taste it, it's like a party in your mouth. It just has flavor that won't quit.
One more thing while we're on the subject. From time to time, you may hear someone refer to a pale ale. Pale ale is really the bottled version of an English bitter ale. The only difference is that it has a higher degree of carbonation and sometimes a more defined malty quality. But pale in this case is an extremely relative term.
That's a glass of beer.
With a deep copper color, it's only pale in comparison to the dark brown porters and stouts you'll discover. So don't confuse this brew with a light beer. You'll find they have about as much in common as a steak and a hot dog. The name comes from its popularity with the laborers, the porters of 18th century London. Wherever its popularity began, this is a very distinct style.
If you're going to taste a porter, it would be dark in color, but not opaque. So if you hold up to a light, a strong light, or in the sun if you're in a garden, it would be a very rich red mahogany color. Quite dark, but not opaque. And it would be a very full, rich beer that would have complex flavors of both malt undertones and hop flavors as well. It would have a certain amount of ale character, a fair bit of ale character, which is like a fruitiness contributed by the yeast. And you would have your hands full with a good English porter.
Made from roasted, unmalted barley, this is an almost black brew, thicker and heavier than the other ales, with a sudsy tan head. It has a moderate to high alcohol content and a taste that ranges from extremely bitter to malty sweet.
Scotland the brave! Advance by the center! Quick! March!
Similar to England, but with a brewing tradition all its own, Scotland also offers a number of fine ales to choose from.
That's something else.
One of the reasons I like the Scottish ale is that there's lots of hops in it, but it's sort of mellowed out by the caramel malt. So you don't have either malty or hoppy flavors predominating. So the use of the caramel malt, the special mashing, and the yeast being more or less trained not to take all the carbohydrates out, you end up with a very heavy beer, but with the hops drying out that sweetness, you have a well-balanced beer.
The more distinct of the Scottish ales are strong and full-bodied. They often have a rich mahogany color and a creamy texture. Ireland, too, has a brewing tradition with very deep roots. But to the Irish, nothing compares to a stout, the closest thing they have to a national drink.
Real Irishman.
That's a good one.
Stouts are a world unto themselves. There's quite a few different subcategories of them that are very distinctive from each other. You can have an oatmeal stout, which is one that's made with not just malted barley, but it actually has some oatmeal added to the mash tun in the brewing process, and that tends to impart a creaminess to it that is very nice. Another style of stout is an imperial stout, and that is a kind that it's a very big beer. It's very alcoholic. It was originally brewed in England for import to the Tsars of Russia, which is why to the imperial court, and they had to make it very high alcohol to transport it that distance without it going bad. So it's a very robust. It's the stout of stouts.
The name stout was shortened from stout porter, a darker version of the popular English porter. Like porter, stouts are quite dark and extremely full-bodied. But they're also richer and, in some cases, creamier. There's an English version, too, known as milk stout, which can be very sweet. From the Anglo-Celtic brewing tradition, we move on to something more diverse and eccentric, the ales of Belgium. You haven't heard of it? You're not alone. Belgium produces more styles of beer than any other country in the world. And yet, very few people this side of the Atlantic have ever tasted Belgian beer. One reason is that many are simply not available to us. Another is that their stronger specialty brews and regional favorites tend to be quirky or overpowering. But perhaps the best explanation is that, unlike the English bitter or the Irish stout, Belgian beer cannot be narrowed down to a single distinct family. There's simply so many choices, it's hard to know where to begin.
Belgian beers are the most esoteric of all beers and in many ways defy description, but that also is their attraction. The fact of the matter is that it's not all that complicated, and if the drinker considers that most Belgian ales are top fermented, most Belgian beers, I should say, are top fermented, and vary as to the nature of the yeast that is used and the geographical regions within Belgium, it's not so awfully difficult to classify them. I think more important really even than classification is just the enjoyment of Belgian beers, which are wonderful beers by standards of beers in any other part of the world. Beers like the Orval that we have in front of us here is certainly among the most complex of all beers.
In Belgium, it's not unusual to find a style of beer that has been in continuous production since the Middle Ages. With that kind of tradition, there's a number of classics out there if you know where to look. Give one a try. You could be starting a whole new tradition for yourself. Of course, as you explore the many different styles of beer available, you'll also discover that some just don't seem to quite fit in. That's because for one reason or another, they're the exceptions to the rules. Let's take a look at a couple of these right now. There's one uniquely North American style that's been around for barely a century: steam beer. It started in San Francisco during the gold rush. With a taste for lager just coming into style and no reliable refrigeration, a resourceful pioneer brewer used a bottom yeast fermented at top yeast temperature. Miraculously, the result was a dry lager with some of the flavor of a pale ale.
Ironically, these first brewers only had the lager yeast, and to make lager in those days before refrigeration, ice and snow had to be harvested in the wintertime, and they would pack this snow and ice around the vessels in order to make the wort cool enough to add the yeast. Well, nobody was going to go harvest snow and ice in San Francisco when there was gold and other things to be found. So these first brewers, having only the lager yeast to work with, had to find a way of cooling the wort with no snow and ice. So rather than using deep vessels, they used shallow, broad, long pans, and the fog rolls into San Francisco every afternoon, and the temperature at nighttime is very stable. It's between 58 and 63 degrees, and they found that if they were able to get the wort down to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, that the lager yeast would function, and albeit a little bit faster than normal, they got beer more often than not. So it's really necessity is the mother of invention, and that's how steam beer came to be.
The only surviving version of this style is Anchor Brewing of San Francisco. One very old style that's begun to enjoy new popularity is Weizenbier, or wheat beer. This is a top fermented beer, which makes it a cousin to the ale family. But as you probably already guessed, what makes it distinct is the wheat that's added to the malted barley mash.
The wheat beer is a very sparkling and refreshing drink. It has got a lot of CO2 in it, and is a fruity beer, especially brewed with not only with malted barley. It also has got wheat in it. That's why it's called wheat or Weizen beer.
Most wheat beers are golden in color, though there are darker varieties available. With a sharp, refreshing flavor, you'll find that this style can be a welcome thirst quencher on a hot summer's afternoon. Earlier, we mentioned a new wave of quality brewers, the microbrewery. The growth of these small, mostly regional companies has in many ways challenged our preconception of what beer is. In much the same way that wine lovers came to appreciate the great vintages of Europe in the 1970s, in the 80s, avid beer lovers began to perk up at the taste of imported brews. Soon, they were no longer satisfied with the mass-produced beers. They wanted something to match the styles and qualities of those European labels. About this time, some adventurous American brewers found that by using traditional methods, they could produce a handcrafted beer that met these new, more critical standards and rival brands that had been around for centuries.
I won't say all microbreweries. I would say most microbreweries are run by people who really have the desire to make a beer that's better.
I think the craft breweries have a concept that they don't want to be fully automated. They want to have more hands-on with their product. There's an intimate association that we have with our product because of all the extra painstaking steps we go through around here every day.
An industrial type beer, a so-called industrial type beer, is brewed to not offend anybody. And a craft beer is brewed to please you.
The industrial breweries, it's not they are not called industrial breweries. There are more factories. They are producing beer, and this micro brewers, they are really brewing beers. It's not a factory, it's a brewery.
I like to say that the mass-marketed large U.S. brewers reinvented what beer had been for several thousand years by introducing corn and rice into the recipes for beers. So in certain places in the world, beers that we consider to be the mainstream beers couldn't even be called beers at all.
If you want to drink something for flavor, then drink a microbrew beer. If you want to drink something to quench your thirst, then you should drink the industrial strength beers. But what we provide is flavor. It's as simple as that, really.
If you go and smell a national brand beer, it doesn't have much aroma, but if you smell one of these beers, you'll just be knocked out by the wonderful aromas that you're going to get off of them.
Most of the micros that you will have are, even the lightest beers are going to be more full-bodied, richer, if you will, than an American-style lager.
You'll notice if you analyze all of the major beers, and there's that much difference analytically amongst them. There's not a wide range, whereas in Europe or in England, you know, in the British Isles, if you analyze their major beers, you'd find a wide difference in the analytical parameters. You know, the color, the hop rate, the amount of adjunct they use, everything is quite different.
But the tradition harkens back literally centuries. So it's not like it's a fad and this is a new thing. It's actually a very old thing. And that's reassuring because the product we produce is a result of literally hundreds of years of evolution to what it is today. And so it's not a passing fancy. Once a person becomes acquainted with these beers, there is no turning back.
Microbrews have begun to carve out a place for themselves in an overcrowded beer market. Nowhere is this truer than in the Northwest, including Northern California and British Columbia. You'll find that this region has some of the most interesting and popular brews anywhere. But there are now microbreweries all over North America. The reason is clear. They offer the quality beer and variety of styles that the beer lover has come to appreciate. But each microbrewery is different, with their own selection of handcrafted lagers, bitters, and bocks. So you'd be well advised to take advantage of another benefit to this boom in microbreweries. Each year, many celebrate their vocation with beer tasting events, festivals, and other gatherings for the beer-loving public. There's no better way to find out about this growing movement than to ask the people who created it. So check around, especially in time for Oktoberfest. Chances are there's a festival going on where you can savor the fruits of their labor.
This is great!
However different these great beers may be, there's one thing all the brewers agree on: the importance of quality over quantity. They want you to enjoy each glass just the way it was made, slowly and with care. So, as you sample these brews, be responsible. Remember that any amount of alcohol can impair your driving ability. Depending on your size and weight, you could be legally drunk after just a few beers. Plan ahead, know your limit, and never drink and drive.
There's a wide variety of styles and tastes, and some are done well, some are not done well. But people need to get out there and try them and see what they've been missing.
Is go at it with a very open mind, be receptive to the flavors, and look at the beer. Don't just drink it to quench your thirst, but you know, analyze the flavors and enjoy the flavors that are playing off of each other.
Well, I think if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a taste is worth 1,000 pictures. And what I like to do is let people taste the beers.
You may not acquire the taste at all, or right away, or anything in between. But I encourage you just to keep sampling, because you'll find probably something in there that's interesting, that's intriguing, and it will draw you back.
To me, beer is just precious, and because of the background and the history and the tradition of it, it's my life. You know, I find it overwhelmingly interesting when you look at these factors. And so, you know, so often people say, "Oh, you're a brewer, or you work for a brewery." Oh, right on. It's like, no, man, it's serious. It's real important, and it's nutritious. It helps keep civilizations alive, and it's something that goes. You know, you should sit down and enjoy and relax and enjoy it with a good meal. It tastes good, you know. Don't misuse it. That's the most important thing for me.
Well, that's about it. Our guide to beer and ales. Now, a program like this can only take you so far. The next step is up to you. So now that you know what you're looking for, go on out there and find it. Thank you. You couldn't have picked a better time. For the first time in more than 50 years, the number of breweries is on the rise. For the beer lover, that means more choices, different styles, and better quality. We hope you enjoy all three. Cheers.